Welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Eric Olson
and Jayden Garcia.
Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Westin MCAT podcast. I am your host, Eric, and I'm here with Jayden Garcia, MD, the distinguished ear, nose, and throat surgeon in training. Jayden, how's it going?
It's good, man. It's good. Yeah, things are good.
I wanted to talk. We were thinking back about our med school and undergrad days. And Jayden, why don't you tell, it's June. People are taking or have taken the MCAT recently and are getting ready to apply. Tell us about your summer that you were applying to med school. What were you doing? You didn't take a gap year, right? So you were in between years of undergrad. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. I did not do a gap year. So I remember taking the MCAT on May 15th, and that was, I guess, my initial segue into summer. I applied in the first week of June, which I recommend everybody do, at least in the first week of the application cycle. I think any time after that, there's some penalty that can be associated with that choice. And then I think, we were talking about this. There's so many essays to write in that summer. Schools get back to you somewhere at the end of June, and I had already started writing some essays ahead of time of like commonly asked essay questions. Some were helpful, some were not helpful, which I think is a good practice because there's a lot that comes in at once. I think it's a little overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I did try and have a lot of fun too. I think the MCAT's so time consuming that it's hard to think about life outside of the MCAT when you're in the thick of it, even though you probably should have some wellness practices. So I think it was the first time not having that burden on me. It's obviously very stressful to wait for your test, which is back in like a month or so, the results at least. But I tried to get out and swim a lot. I went on vacation to Hawaii. I had a good time, but it was full of activities too. What was yours like?
That sounds awesome. Yeah, it was stressful. You're right, like stressful waiting for your score to get back. Although I gotta say, after the first 2 weeks, I was thinking about it a lot, and then after that, I kind of forgot, and it was a surprise when it showed up in the mail or in my email, I guess. Similarly, I took it on May 19th, so that was my intro to summer, and I also pre-wrote some essays. I remember I applied to Duke. I don't know. Did you apply to Duke?
I did initially. I think I know where this is going. We'll see.
Well, yeah. Well, here I applied to Duke, and and they had all these essays. It was like 5 or 6 different essays, and I don't know why. I must have like pre-written a few, and for whatever reason, I got to Duke, and I was like, I should just write some of these. So I wrote. I don't know if I wrote all of them, but I wrote essays based on what had been asked the previous year, and then the essay questions came out and they were all different, and I was like, oh my gosh. So yeah, some of them, it was helpful in certain instances, but that was a big time sink that ended up not going anywhere. What was your experience with Duke?
I didn't end up applying. It was so many essays
because the essays, yeah,
it was too many, and
they weeded you out, man.
I know they did. They weeded me out good because I didn't even consider once I saw how many there were.
I was doing I did this research position in outside of DC where my wife is from, and we lived with her parents that summer, and I would commute in, and the thing was actually in Maryland, and so it was like I would wake up super early. I mean, it wasn't like surgery hours early, but I think it was before 6, which is early for the summer,
It's early.
I'd wake up early, and then I would drive into the metro, then I would get on the metro, and I would, metro up to where this thing was at, and it was like 2 hours each way. Because I was talking to my wife about it the other day, and we were reminiscing on the summer. I said, "What did we do that summer?" Oh yeah, I was just commuting the whole day. It was a lot. I mean, it was good for thinking about essays, and I got some writing done because I was on public transport, but um, it was just a lot of commuting, and I did some research, some immunology stuff, which was interesting, but um, it was a lot of essays and a lot of driving, and my wife is always telling me that Washington D.C. is a great place to live, which I don't dispute per se, but the driving was so much and the
Oh yeah,
traffic was so bad that I'm always like, oh yeah, I mean, it's nice, but I mean, there's trade-offs, right? And
trade-offs
we
with
just
every
we should have lived
place.
closer in. That was the real issue. And it was so expensive to get a place like in DC or in there close that it made more sense to be living with her parents. But I paid for it on the transportation front. That's what I remember from that summer.
Right. I gotta ask, Eric, what was the move? Was it strategic to do an internship when the application was basically already done? How did you decide on that?
I mean, I put it on my application because
Nice.
I had, it had been arranged and like I knew what the dates were going to be and I had research was like the thing that I was trying to highlight. On my application. So I was like, this is a thing. It's a different experience. I had done research in my undergrad lab and I
Mm-hmm.
had done a different internship at a different facility. And I was like, it's a different field, although adjacent to what I'd previously done, and it's a different institution. And so I was just like, and the alternative was like, I don't know what the alternative was,
Yeah.
but I think we both wanted to spend a summer near her family,
Yeah.
and so that was part of it. It
Two
was it
birds,
was a
one stone.
multifactorial decision for sure. Yeah.
It's good for people to hear because I've gotten the question over the years, like, is there any value to utilizing that last summer to get something quick on the resume? And it sure worked out for you. That I think it's good for people to hear because I'm sure some of our listeners may have similar questions as they approach the application cycle.
Yeah, I mean, I
They're
don't
in it.
know. I don't know that it made a huge difference. Maybe it
Mhm.
did. Maybe it didn't, but I didn't. I was sufficiently terrified of not getting in that I
Yeah.
wanted to do everything that I could. So, but it doesn't sound like it was quite as fun as your summer. So I don't know. Maybe I lost out
Uh,
on
you
a
were more
good time.
productive. You got those Duke essays finished.
Yeah, yeah, and it did me a lot of good too. Okay, enough of that. Let's talk psych soc, Jayden.
Ooh.
And there are a lot of topics in psych soc that are
Mhm.
important. I'm thinking about. I really like the theories of emotion and the theories of development. I find those really interesting, although I'm not sure they are the highest yield. I think they usually come up on a question or two, but not always. But today we're going to talk about something that I find less exciting, but is probably higher yield. So probably more important for us to talk about, and that is nature versus nurture. And I think probably everyone has had a conversation about nature versus nurture, hopefully in an undergraduate biology course or some similar kind of format. But this is, frankly, not only an important topic for the MCAT, but an important topic for medicine as we kind of discuss, where disease states come from and different factors that contribute to those disease states and things. Nature versus nurture is relevant in the clinical space, and it has been a really important way of, or I guess, an important field of study over the past, really kind of like couple hundred years as we've been trying to tease out how these factors interplay. Jayden, what do you think? Like, where do you see this coming up for test takers?
Yeah, I think this topic is frankly more relevant for MCAT than what gets discussed even in medical school. I'm trying to think I may have had a lecture or so on it in med school, but I do think the MCAT authors like to test this. Um, I think they like to test the different types of studies that help answer the question, does um, some outcome have more of an influence from the genetic side of it or the upbringing side of it? And so I think first and foremost, knowing this, the types of studies that help answer those questions, which we'll get to, knowing the advantages and disadvantages of studies, and kind of the personnel involved in those studies as well. Are they twins? Are
Yeah.
they not? Are they
Yeah.
identical? Or are they not? Are they, how are they genetically related to help us answer the question? That would be my number one thing to focus on. I'd point a student in that direction first. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think, and when I talk about psych soc as a section, similarly to what you're saying, like I think that study design comes into play a lot more than anywhere else. In CP and in BB, you have a lot more like of these. The studies usually make sense, but sometimes the methods are not really focused on. But I feel like maybe not more often than not, but a significant proportion of the time, you're going to get some study and they're going to ask something about the methods or, what kind of bias there was or something like that in the psych social section. So I do think, when we talk about these different psychology and sociology principles, it's important to be thinking about what are the methods they're using to test these things, and what do these experiments look like and things like that. Like when they talk about I don't know. Maybe this is not important. I'm just thinking I remember learning about I think it's Stanley Milgram who did the experiments with there was someone with a white coat and they were instructing someone to press a button to deliver an electric shock. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And they cranked it up to the death level and the person initially was yelling stop, stop, and then they stopped, implying that they had either passed out or died. Um, those sorts of things when we're talking and the Bobo doll experiment, these are experiments that I learned specifically. I learned for the MCAT. I think it was helpful, to really remember. It's been, I haven't talked about that in a while.
Still
But
remember.
I remember these principles and the things that they taught because of the experimental methods. And I think that helped me on the MCAT because, in the psych social section, they're going to give you some random experiment that they did and you're a little bit more familiar with what methods look like and what controls look like and independent and dependent variables based on the experiments that were already run by these people, that demonstrated principles that you're supposed to know.
Right.
And so I agree with you. Does it come into play on chem phys and biochem? Maybe. And frankly, this whole question of nature versus nurture could come into play in those other sections. I think it's less likely, but also not impossible. Let's talk a little bit about origins of the debate. So if I remember correctly, I wouldn't say the debate really started with this, but where I will start the conversation is with Darwin, kind of era of Darwin. He had a cousin, Galton, who I think also has some other thing that we're supposed to know for the MCAT, maybe about intelligence or something like that. But this dude Galton, it was around the time of Darwin where he was exploring genetic traits, and he went and did the sparrow thing in the Galapagos, and people were like, oh, there are genes and genetic traits that are contributing to the way that birds look and that different animals phenotypes present. And this guy Galton was like, oh yeah, that probably happens in humans too, and specifically with intelligence and behavior. That it's an inherited trait, right? You get what you get from your parents and from your grandparents and things like that. And initially, this was used kind of as this was like what, 19th century that Darwin was around in the 1800s. And this is in Europe, and like people were using this sort of argument to say that like, the aristocrats are like smarter and, better people than peasants, and like that's why it is, because it's genetic. Like they're just born that way. They're just naturally better, which we obviously like don't don't say today is not what we believe. And then, so that was kind of the theory at the time, was like everything is nature. Nature being our genes, what makes us up biologically. The alternative to the nature argument is this idea of nurture. Like we're born as a blank slate, and I think it was Locke that said it, that
I think
we're a
that's
blank
right.
slate, right? We're a blank slate, and like whatever we become is just a conglomerate of like environmental factors that have happened upon us, right? And that was kind of the thought in the late 19th and through a good part of the 20th century as well, I believe. So initially we had this focus on genetics and nature, and then we kind of swung the other way and said, no, nature has pretty much nothing to do with it. It's all about, how your mother raises you and all this stuff like that. And in kind of the late 20th century and today, we're kind of saying, well, that's probably not true. It's more of a mix of both of these things. Your genetics do predetermine some things about you, and then kind of the way that you're interacted with and the way that you're taught by the people around you is going to contribute some other proportion of your behavior and your mannerisms and things like that. Um, Jayden, you talked a little bit about like different studies and what we use to study this sort of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about like twin studies, for example, and how that has played into our understanding of nature versus nurture?
Yeah, so twin studies is a very important study designed to understand. And I think big picture, you can imagine if we have twins and they're identical, meaning they share the same genotype, they have the same genes, and you follow these twins, identical twins over time, and you observe what happens to them. Maybe you have a certain outcome of interest, and you see that they both end up having some outcome that's the same that may be rare, for example. That would make a very strong argument towards something being genetic because they both had something rare happen to them by sharing the same genome. Imagine if the opposite happened, like some rare occurrence happened, but the other twin didn't get it. I think it doesn't rule it out, but it certainly is not as supportive for a genetic cause of whatever outcome you're interested in. And it makes for really great studies because it's really hard to obviously replicate, the same genome in a species. Other than having twins, it's virtually impossible. And so to observe a certain phenotype or expression among two people with the same DNA, it's a really great opportunity. Eric, what would you add to twin studies, for example?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, we've talked a little bit about like analyzing study design and things like that. And when you have a well-run study, you have to have uh you have to have an independent variable, right? The independent variable is the thing you're changing. So, rudimentary example, say that I did a science fair project. This is a real life example. How about that? I did a science fair project when I was in like fifth grade, and I was trying to find out which I grew up in Florida, so there's a lot of sun. I wanted to figure out like how different fabrics responded to sun exposure, like as far as changing their color, kind of like bleaching sort of thing. So I have like a black cotton square and a polyester square and like a rayon square and like all these different fabrics, and I put them out in the sun for a week, and then I brought them back in and like looked at how the color had changed. Right? I don't remember the findings, unfortunately, but like everything is the same in that experiment except for the type of fabric that you're looking at. Right? That's your independent variable. And the problem with this nature versus nurture thing is like, how do we have one single independent variable that we're looking at? Because we can't either control the genes and make two people have the exact same genome unless you have twins, right? And we can't control the environment and make it so that people have the exact same environment, because even if you're in the same home, like there are little factors that might be different. Maybe two people are in the same city, but like you can have very different environmental experiences, you know, on one side of Chicago versus the other side of Chicago, right? And so the thing about these twin studies is you're able to control either for nature or for nurture. And so, for example, if you have identical twins, they have the same genetic makeup, so nature is going to be the same. That's a controlled variable. If you put them in two separate homes, then you're evaluating for nurture, right? You're evaluating their environment and how their environment contributes to, their phenotype, their makeup, their behavior, whatever it is that you want to study. The alternative that we haven't really talked about yet is kind of like an adoption study, right? So, like, say my wife and I we have two children, and we decide we want to have another, but we instead of having a child ourselves, we adopt a child, and so then those two children have effectively completely different genetic makeups, right? Like they don't share any genetic material because one of them is not our child and the other one is, but they're in the same home, so they have a very similar environment. The environmental piece is not perfectly controlled for because they might get some different interaction. But in that case, you're changing the genetic makeup, you're changing the nature, and you're controlling for nurture. You're giving them the same environment. And so this like sort of adoption studies and twin studies have allowed us to control for one of these variables while we evaluate for the other. There are of course ethical considerations in like, are you going to take identical twins and send one to Cambodia and keep the other one here with its parents in the United States? Like, probably not, right? That's not like the right thing to do. But there have been instances where there have been identical twins. I remember reading, I think in my like psychology class in high school, about these twins who had been separated at birth. And that's like, the prototypical, the best kind of twin study you could have.
Study. Yeah, right.
I don't think they were like separated at birth, but I think they were orphans and they were like, adopted out to two different families. And, they reunited when they were like 50 years old. They were both firefighters. They looked exactly the same. They both had like a mustache. They both had high cholesterol. They both had had a heart attack in their late 40s. And so it was like, wow, these twins are very similar, even though they grew up in different environments. Like their genetic similarity obviously played a role in some of the decisions that they made and some of the outcomes that they had, health outcomes that they had over their life. So something like that, for example, would suggest to us that nature or, your genetic makeup has something to do with your cardiovascular risk, right? And we see that plays out. Heart disease runs in families. If your dad and his mom all died from a heart attack in their 40s, then you have a high risk of having a heart attack. That's real life. That's been proven, right? So these sorts of studies are the kinds of things that help us to tease out how nature and nurture will kind of interact in determining, an individual's phenotype. Jayden, can you tell us about? Oh, go ahead. I was going to ask if you can
add some of these caveats that I feel like come up on the test a little bit, because as Eric was pointing out, there are some downsides and some dominoes that need to fall to really make this a good study. And you brought up the adoption study. An adoption study works best if you have information about the biological child who was adopted, right? Because it's not absolutely necessary, but if the MCAT were to ask you what could strengthen the study, having biological information on that child is really important, because we're assuming that the genetics are so different by somebody being adopted. But if you don't truly know, right? What if you were trying to study like limb length and you were looking at two different, an adopted and a biological child, but you had no idea what was the limb length of the parents of the adopted child? Like, it's hard to draw a strong conclusion there if there really was a
Yeah.
difference. So that's important, I think, for the adoption study is if you can get your hands on the information on the child, which often doesn't happen if a kid's adopted, it helps. To the twin studies, like to Eric's point, it's very rare to be able to have identical twins separated in two very different upbringings. It happens. It's probably the best case scenario to study. But you can still have meaningful identical twin studies without changing the upbringing, because sometimes there's another sibling who's not a twin in the family. And that's an acceptable design to compare the twins to the outcome of another sibling who's not a twin, because there is a genetic difference. We've still compared. It may not be as great as separating the twins, but you've been able to change some of the DNA between two different individuals and see if that's replicated in both twins. And the other caveat I'll give is, like, in that scenario, having a rare occurrence is most helpful. If something's super common, and you do a twin study, it's hard to draw conclusions because of how common the outcome is. If it's something super rare and you see it happen in both twins, even though they're raised in the same upbringing, it does make the case stronger that there could be a strong genetic component. If it's rare. If it's common and almost everybody has it, it's hard to draw that conclusion because of the setup. So I just wanted to point out some of those caveats because they can come up. And if you just kind of think through the upsides and downsides of each study, you'll be well on your way to get questions correctly, because the MCAT does like to test the pros and cons of different study designs.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not uncommon for them to say, how would you improve this study design
Right.
either?
How can we strengthen it?
That's a very important point. I'm a monozygotic twin. You know that, right?
Yeah, I do. You guys look very similar.
I find myself wondering, like, what kind of studies could we have run or were run that I don't know about on me? Monozygotic versus dizygotic, though, right? So, like, monozygotic came from one zygote. There was an early split, implanted in different locations. You effectively have a clone, right? Like the same organism twice. So that's a good twin study. Again, we control for genetic makeup, and then any change in the environment. So, for example, like if I don't know, if my mom had been like, oh, this we only have so much formula, and we have like a bunch of peaches because we have a peach tree or something. This is not real. I'm just making this up. But she was like, we're going to feed this one a bunch of peaches, and this other one is going to get, formula, and we're going to see what happens. That would be like a good twin. That's like a different environment, right? Like you're getting fed one thing versus the other. Whereas the genetic makeup is the same. So like that's kind of a rudimentary kind of twin study that you might see. And that would show you differences in nurture, right? Differences in upbringing or environment. The alternative like would be in dizygotic twins, which is kind of similar to what you were saying with a sibling. But like dizygotic twins are effectively like siblings that were just born at the same time, right? So there is some difference in genetic makeup, but the environment or upbringing should be fairly similar. So you might be able to determine if there are differences that are brought about by genetic makeup in those cases. So these are just, these are different sorts of cases that might be important to be aware of, right? These are not uncommon study designs, and they're not unlikely to come up on the MCAT either.
I was also going to point out, with you being a twin, you can study twins later in life. We always assume like we're this nurture idea of like when you were 5 years old or 4 years old, but you and your brother have had two distinct paths. You've lived in two different countries with different exposures, or you've lived in, like, you were in Brazil for a while, right? And your brother was not in Brazil. Oh, oh my gosh. Okay. We can't use that one.
Yeah,
but I mean, like, you've lived in different parts of the US. You've had maybe different, I think he's becoming a doctor too, right? Now? Or is he the private equity?
Yeah, private equity.
So, I mean, interesting. You've had different environmental exposures being in the hospital compared to somebody who's in private equity. So, there's still, I want our listeners to understand you can still study twins after they're like 5 years old, right? Because they do have eventually there's a divergence in exposure and environment, typically.
Yeah.
So, anyways,
The other thing I wanted to just touch on is that like in the 21st century, we focus a little bit more on like a biopsychosocial approach, right? So where we initially had thought, or some people had thought that it was all about genetics and genetic makeup. Then we kind of swung towards thinking that everything was socially learned and nurtured into us. And now we kind of say, some of these things everything that we do is multifactorial, right? So some of these things are learned, some of these things are innate. Like for example, temperament, and I think this is on the MCAT too. But temperament is like you're kind of born with it. Like some kids are kind of anxious and like easily cry and things like that, and that tends to persist over the course of a lifetime. And so that's like kind of maybe a nature thing that they're kind of born with and that just sticks with them. Whereas, maybe learning to be polite versus being rude, that could maybe be a nurture thing. And so again, then like the way that you interact with someone is going to be based on a variety of factors, your genetic makeup, your environmental learning, like how you learned from your parents, what you saw in school from your peers, as well as kind of what your own, like aspects of your psychological makeup are going to influence as well. So let's do a couple of examples, Jayden, if that's okay with you. And maybe I will give you an example, and you can kind of walk through any thoughts that you have,
yeah,
if that's okay, and I'll chime in as well. Um, so, for example, like, hang on, I have some things written down over here. So like, what kind of things would we learn, for example, if you had, like, if you had a child who was a biological child of parents, and these parents were like, the mom was a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and the dad was, like a cardiologist at Mass General. And they had a child, and then they wanted another, and they couldn't have another, and so they adopt a child that's like the child of well, we don't have to get into the specifics of who the child is. Let's say we don't know anything about the parents. Okay.
right.
But these children grow up kind of together. Maybe they're a year or two apart. But they both are like super high achieving in school. They both go on to study, at like an Ivy League institution, and they both go on to become like leaders in their field. Then kind of what would that tell you from a nature versus nurture perspective of like how these different factors are influencing their success or their trajectory in life?
Yeah, so I mean, this is essentially an adoption study, right? There was a kid who's adopted, and we're trying to evaluate, does the kid have the same outcome as the biological child? And from what I'm hearing, Eric, this child does. They have the outcome being like success in school, intelligence, all of these things. So I think it'd be easy for us to make this argument that like intelligence and success in school is more of an environmental process and less about genetics, because we have two different genetic siblings who ended up with the same outcome under the same like upbringing. But remember the assumptions here. One, how old was this kid, right? I mean, if you had a kid that was 10 years old coming in, that's not the same as being raised as an infant. I think some other things to consider is Eric specifically said we don't know anything about the parents of the adopted child, biological parents. Well, that ends up being very important if we're going to make the conclusion that this is an environmental process. Because what if that child also had high achieving intellectual parents, and there was some mix up at the hospital, or there was something, a death, in the family? Well, maybe the genetics were fairly similar, and the environment would have been similar. So I think it's hard, but I think that the overarching takeaway from this adoption study is, well, it's probably environmental given the likely genetic differences.
Yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Um, the other thing I would just note, and you're kind of touching on this, but like these are case studies, right? This is one example. So you certainly can't say like, oh, all academic achievement or like all, professional success is based on environmental factors. Even if we found out that these people were like definitely not related and like maybe the parents were, I don't know, like you can never draw that conclusion and generalize it, right? Because you would need to study with like hundreds, thousands of patients or, individuals before you started to say like, hey, I think we're seeing a causative relationship here, right?
Right. Because this is a
Okay.
natural experiment, and I think it's worth mentioning that, there's levels of evidence, as Eric was alluding to, and the top of that chain is probably, a randomized controlled trial, which becomes incredibly difficult to do in these types of studies because it's unethical, right? I can't just take two twins and throw one somewhere and start manipulating things. So natural experiments is a type of observational study where we're essentially observing in a natural environment, right? We're not bringing all patients to a clinic and measuring their smoke intake and whether or not they get lung cancer 50 years down the road. That would be an observational study, but that's not natural. I brought them into the clinic. I, I'm not manipulating a factor, but I'm not observing these patients in their natural environment per se. Whereas, twin studies and adoption studies are natural experiments. So it's important to understand the difference there. The other thing I'd mention, I think this is really funny because, Eric brought up this example of a doctor and Nobel Prize physicist or something having a child, and my genetics professor in med school said there's some scoring system, some statistical measure of how closely things are what we call heritable, really being able to be passed down from generation to generation, genetics or environmental. And becoming a doctor is actually one of the most heritable traits that any human can have based on some of these statistical analyses.
Wow.
And I think it's very interesting. And it is probably this biopsychosocial crossover. There's probably a genetic component where there's some maybe advantages to intellect, but there's probably some other psychosocial component too, of like doctors are more likely to have money to send their kids to nicer schools, to have more opportunity to then become doctors. It's a really interesting question and thought experiment, but just a fun fact for you, apparently becoming a doctor, which all of you are trying to do, is one of the most heritable things.
Yeah, and you have to wonder too. I mean, you're touching on these things, but like, is there some sort of other psychosocial component of like maybe their doctor parent enjoys their job, and so they see that, and it's like learned like this is a good job that you can find satisfaction in. I don't know.
Right? Yeah, the
Do you
inherent
do you
aspects
have
of the
doctor
job.
parents?
I
You don't have
don't.
doctor parents, do
So
you?
I
Me
don't.
neither.
No. So it's obviously not foolproof, right? But
Yeah,
it's
we'll have to
interesting
see with our kids, I
with our
guess, if that
kids.
passes down. My identical twin who's in private equity, he always says that he thinks his son is going to want to be a doctor because he thinks that my job is going to be so great. He's like, my son's going to see you as a doctor and how great it is and how much you love it, and he's going to be a doctor too. So
Just like
I
Uncle
don't know.
Eric, huh?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess so. Okay, cool. Let's do another one. And thanks for
Yeah.
your commentary. That's perfect. Okay, so say we have, a pair of identical twins, monozygotic twins, and they're born in, like coal mining country. So like, uh, what's the name of that city in West Virginia? I don't know, somewhere in West Virginia where they mine coal, we'll say. And one of them, they both go to an orphanage. One of them gets adopted by a family in the town and stays there. The other one gets adopted by a family that then moves to, I don't know, Boston. And, they don't know each other exists and they're just doing their thing and they're growing up. And at the age of 11, the one that lives in Boston comes down with a rare tumor uh, with a rhabdomyosarcoma. How about that? That's a thing, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So, they have the same genetics. What kinds of conclusions can we draw, or what sorts of things are we learning from this case about the incidence or like causative factors for rhabdomyosarcoma?
Yeah. I mean, we would need to take a look
I
at
guess I should emphasize that the one in West Virginia, coal mining country,
did
does
not.
not develop any tumor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that'd be the first thing I'd say to our listeners. What happened to the other twin? Right? Because our conclusions are 100% drawn from what happens to the other twin. In this setting, we have two genetically identical children who have two different outcomes. So that really starts to point away from a genetic cause, because we'd have to ask ourselves, why is it that this other child who had the same genetics didn't develop the tumor? And it would maybe be much more influenced by an environmental factor, what's going on in Boston. And I think another point here is the two, nature and nurture, and I think this is what we've discovered in this timeline of studying this, can interplay. So there's things called epigenetics, where we have this genetic code, and there are a whole bunch of like macromolecules surrounding the DNA that may influence if it gets expressed or not. But we know now in many different settings that certain environments, or sorry, there is an interplay between the environmental exposure and the DNA that may turn on some genes or turn off some genes to have some sort of outcome. And so, could there be something in Boston that this child was genetically predisposed to having that turned on a gene that caused a rhabdomyosarcoma? That the child in West Virginia was never exposed to that, but had they been, they might have actually developed the tumor. And so I want the student, I didn't understand what epigenetics was for a long time, even in med school. So I just want our listeners to understand this principle that you can have the same genetic code, but you can alter some of the macromolecules surrounding that code that may lead to a different outcome. And perhaps it's environmental, perhaps it's not. But that's kind of my 2 cents. Eric, I'll throw it back.
No, beautiful. Yeah, I think, and we said this on the last one. I'll say it again. These twin studies are great. They are cases. So a case as opposed to a cohort, right? Where a cohort has lots of individuals included in the study. We can really draw conclusions from cohorts, and like Jayden said, a randomized controlled trial kind of being the gold standard of trying to draw conclusions, because we're controlling for everything and manipulating one variable in a large study population. Whereas in a case, it's interesting, but you can't now say that everyone who lives in Boston is going to get a rhabdomyosarcoma, right? Like that's not what we're doing here. But it does kind of point away from this nature point of view.
Imagine if the twin had gotten the tumor, is an interesting thought experiment, right? Because rhabdomyosarcomas are rare. They're rare. They're rare. They're rare. And to have two different siblings in different parts of the country, that would be a strong, strong argument for
Absolutely.
nature. Whereas,
Absolutely.
like, this is kind of a weak argument for nurture. Had the twin had the tumor, that would have been a strong argument for nature in the setting of as Eric pointed out, a case study.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, let's do one more, and then we'll close. This last one, I want to hear kind of your thought process, and I want to talk about it from a biopsychosocial standpoint. Okay. I know this is maybe a little bit outside of your current position, but probably something that you may have encountered in medical school. So say that you have a patient coming in to clinic and they're telling you that they're sad and they've lost interest in the things they used to like to do, and they feel like they don't have any energy anymore, and they feel depressed, and it's been going on for 4 weeks. Then this patient has depression, right? there are certain criteria that we have for diagnosing depression, and they're meeting criteria. And so you ask them a little more, a few more questions about themselves and about what's been going on. They tell you that their dad has depression. This, I mean, doesn't really matter how old this patient is, but their dad has depression. Their mom has anxiety. They feel like their job is pretty stressful. Maybe they're an air traffic controller, and that's supposed to be a pretty stressful job. And they're in this relationship that's like very up and down, and it feels like they just like can't get on the same page as their partner, person they're involved with. And this has all been getting worse over the last couple of months. Like, what kinds of things are you thinking about? Like, not only how would you treat this patient, not that it is really needed for the MCAT, but like some of the treatment that you might provide or recommend may address some of these things from kind of like this biopsychosocial perspective, right? So like, what are the factors that may be contributing here, and how are you going to help them from that perspective to try to treat their disease?
Well, if we break up biopsychosocial from the bio aspect, the genetics, I don't think there's much we can do from that standpoint. Genetics are somewhat set in stone. I think it's helpful discussion in the future from like a prophylactic setting is usually where the bio aspect of it can be most helpful. Because maybe this person has children in the future, and it's something that this parent will want to be aware of, that there could be a connection.
Right.
And I think that's
exactly. So if I can just, I'm sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but
please.
I just really, what I was doing there is I just wanted to emphasize, like, we're not just talking about the job, but like we may not treat them from a genetic perspective, but it does seem like if both of their parents have these psychiatric conditions, that there may be something there from a family history standpoint.
Right.
It might be something that's being passed down, and it's something to take into account. But as you said, not exactly something that we would specifically be able to treat.
But patients often do want to know the origin of their problem. Like it is not uncommon for this person to say, like, is this from my dad? Did I get this from my dad? We get asked these questions all the time, and I think it's helpful to explain that, it's multifactorial, but being aware of your family history, if you decide to include children in your life in the future, is helpful. From the psychosocial component, certainly explaining that stress certainly can be a cause of depression, and helping them see that, whether they're more genetically inclined to be depressed, certainly their current setup, being an air traffic control person and having a difficult relationship, can exacerbate the problem, and it's all coming together to play a role. And these aren't very satisfying answers I found to people, because they're looking for one, tell me what's going on and where it came from. But to your point, Eric, I think this is a perfect example of where there's so much happening from different facets of this person's life, that helping them kind of tease out where some of the pain points are coming from is most helpful to treating them and helping them understand their problem.
Yeah, beautiful. I think, like, standard of care for major depression is cognitive behavioral therapy and SSRI. And so, we're talking about, when we talk about bio in this biopsychosocial, we were talking a little bit more about genetics. But, as far as like a biological component to disease, like there can be neurotransmitter abnormalities that could potentially be contributing to these sorts of symptoms. And so we try to treat that with a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I think treats kind of the psycho aspect of biopsychosocial. The social aspect is a little bit more difficult. I think it could warrant some counseling maybe on what are your job options. Do you think it would be helpful to switch jobs in order to reduce your stress level? I certainly don't get involved in patients' romantic relationships, but it could be worthwhile to recommend like a couples therapy or something like that if it seems to be really causing them a lot of difficulty. So, there are a lot of things that could be contributing to a given disease process. We're talking about a psychiatric example, but the same could be said for other kind of more traditionally biological examples of other
Mhm.
diseases. And it can be important in a clinical setting to be thinking about all these things as we worry about our patients and as we try to determine the best ways to be treating them. Well, good. That's pretty much all we have for this episode. As we said, I mean, there are kind of a lot of variables here, but the important things I think to note from this conversation are these kind of twin studies and adoption studies and kind of how we tease out, how we control for nature or nurture, and what we can learn when we control for one of those things. Again, even though we're controlling for nature in a twin study, or that doesn't mean that we can draw absolute conclusions as to like whatever outcomes we see. But these are important things to be able to understand, what's being controlled and how we're manipulating things and what we're trying to get at. And these are things that will certainly come up on the MCAT. So good to be aware of. Jayden, anything else to add?
I'll say my very first interview at medical school was at Texas Tech El Paso. And one of the first questions I was asked was, tell me your thoughts on the biopsychosocial model of disease. And at the time, I didn't know what that term meant. And so it was a very important learning point because sometimes somebody's going to ask you something that you don't know the answers to. So this is, I guess, a plug for some of the students who may be interviewing soon. And so I had to straight up confess, I'm not entirely sure what that is. If you could explain it to me, I can give you my thoughts. Which wasn't satisfying to me, but I couldn't think of a better way to approach it at that point, being asked something I didn't even know what it was. Because the alternative is to totally BS something,
And
which I
maybe
didn't do.
completely miss the mark. Yeah.
Totally missed the mark, and I don't recommend that. I bring this up because this is an important topic. The MCAT likes it. Obviously, my interviewer liked it that day. I think it's a high yield topic that will continue to be present inside your psych-soc sections, but also it will be relevant in your interview skills as well. So hopefully this was helpful.
And with that, we'll leave you. Happy studying.
Bye, guys.